together to God in prayer. Loving God, we give you thanks for the gift of this day. And we ask in these moments now that the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. For you alone are our strength and our salvation. Amen. Today we hear the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. And today's sermon builds upon last week's sermon as we remembered God's call upon Moses' life to lead the people of God out of slavery, through the wilderness, and finally onto the promised land. We also remembered that like Moses, we can have the eyes of faith to see the very presence of God in our midst, even in difficult situations. And we also remembered that like Moses, God still has work for us to do, to speak words of encouragement to those persons that we journey alongside in life, to offer visible, tangible signs of love and hope to people in the larger community. We're also today going to continue to look at the words we heard of last week, words like homeland, that time in life where we feel settled and at peace. Then there is that season in life called Wonderland, where we are disoriented, as if all sense of security has fallen away. And then finally, Newfoundland, where we feel as if we are home again, and yet we are not the same people. We've been changed, transformed because of everything that we've witnessed and seen. This sort of journey is very much a part of every human experience. Father Richard Rohr also teaches about such journeys, and he does so with the language of order, disorder, and finally, reorder. As you consider your own similar experiences in your own life, you know that these sorts of journeys don't follow a predictable linear pattern. In other words, one day you might sense as if you are in a chill, Newfoundland state of mind, only the very next day to feel as if you are back in the wilderness or Wonderland. Moses, he crossed the Red Sea, and that was a pivotal moment in his own life journey. He was transitioning from one season of life into another. He did not know what the future held. It was uncertain and unpredictable. But the one thing he did know is that it would not look like the past that was falling away. He must have felt like he was in his own type of Wonderland. When I think of Wonderland, of course, I can't help but think of the children's book, the movie, Alice in Wonderland. In that story, at one point, Alice finds herself in this hallway. It's a bizarre, strange-looking hallway with multiple doors surrounding her. All the doors are closed and locked. She doesn't know to where they lead, and she doesn't know which one to choose. It's a confusing time and space. Call it a liminal season, call it the wilderness or Wonderland, call it disorder. These are all the very types of places that we want to avoid being in. And yet, these are the types of places to which the biblical God is forever calling God's people. Consider the book of Genesis, when God sends Adam and Eve out of the garden. Or the prophet Jonah, when God sends Jonah into the belly of a whale, a beautiful symbol for the liminal life. And then there is Jesus himself, God sending Jesus out into the desert. These are hard places to live in. But if we open ourselves to the question, God, what are you trying to show me here? Then we just might have new eyes to see things in a new way. We might even experience our own transformation. In this season of pandemic, this wilderness season of pandemic, what is God trying to show you? What is God trying to teach me? What are we learning about ourselves, about our community, about what it means to be church in the world today? Can we see things with a new perspective? I want to give you a simple, ordinary example. Many years ago, I had a job where I traveled more frequently. I flew a lot. As I consider the airport and airplanes, they are not just metaphorically, they are quite literally liminal spaces. That's not a place that you want to go and stay forever. Instead, it's a transition type place. You're coming from one destination and headed to another. As I consider the liminal space of an airport or an airplane, I know that I engage in behavior and activity on the airplane or in the airport that I don't do at any other time in my life, such as sitting next to somebody, the same person, for many, many hours, maybe even sharing an armrest with them and leg space, and yet never speaking a word to them. If I did that on any other day of my life, I'd think it was odd, rude, and yet somehow in the airport or on the airplane, it's kind of normal behavior. The other thing is that I'm not a napper. I cannot sleep during the day. And yet on an airplane, I easily fall asleep no matter what time I'm flying. Finally, in the airports, I would sometimes experience a flight delay or a gate change. But those sorts of disruptions in my schedule, they weren't obnoxious to me. I was kind of indifferent to those sort of disruptions. Yet in my ordinarily daily living, if I, for example, went to the dentist only to find that the dentist was 2 hours late for my scheduled appointment, I'd be really frustrated. Or if I went to get my hair cut and I found that the salon had relocated without my prior knowledge, I'd be very frustrated. And yet, again, I'm indifferent to these sorts of disruptions in the airport. I'd simply just pick up my luggage and walk back and forth down the terminal, which in itself is kind of odd behavior, except for in the airport. How might we begin living differently in this liminal space? The pandemic can be seen as a liminal season for sure, but we live in many liminal seasons, both personally and collectively as humans. Maybe it's going through a divorce or moving a child off to college. Maybe here at university, it's going through a pastoral transition, or in our larger denomination, the ongoing work of General Conference. At the risk of sounding melodramatic, some scholars say that as a civilization, we are undergoing a season of deconstruction as we move and transition into a new era. These can be uncomfortable places in which to live. In such moments, it's quite human of us to fall into despair. But by the grace of God, we can instead choose to be curious. What is possible now that wasn't previously? How is the necessity of doing things differently stretching us and sparking our imagination? A few years ago, I imagined that the staff and the leadership here at University UMC would not, as a whole, have seen the need for a virtual online worship service. And yet now we couldn't imagine our communal life without it. It's a ministry that we see living long after the pandemic is over, for it allows church members to engage in worship when they are outside of the state traveling. It allows us to connect with visitors that we might never find otherwise. Just last week, when we looked at the reality of being at Stage 5 in Austin, and as we considered a desire to return to in-person worship, the possibility of an outdoor worship service was birthed. Doing new things in new ways. Earlier this worship service, we heard Pastor Heather refer to several Pixar films, which often have great quotes in them. The CEO of Pixar is Ed Catmull, and he's led a number of leadership seminars. In one leadership seminar, he said this. He said, "There is a sweet spot between the unknown and the known, where originality happens. And the key is to linger there long enough without panicking." I believe that that's exactly what happened at a recent meeting of your reopening task force and in recent staff meetings. Yes, there might be every reason to panic, and it can be tempting to just flee. But if we stay engaged in conversation, in prayerful discernment, originality happens. Original, which is another way of saying creative and bold, innovative, imaginative, resourceful. This is the discipline of staying present in the uncomfortable space between the known and the unknown, and being surprised by what God can do. Our district superintendent and one of your former pastor's daughters, Reverend Laura Merrill, was with us at our in-person worship service last week. And after the service was over, she said this to me: I don't think this has ever happened at University UMC, worship outside on the church campus. I think this was the first time, she said, but it shouldn't be the last time. Like Moses, when we wade into the water, uncomfortable as it may be, the fears that threaten to destroy us can be transformed into hope and possibility. I wonder what's next. What else might be dreamed up for the first time, but not the last time? Amen.